Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Birds of the Missouri River. This is our last webinar series for this 2020 to 2021 timeframe. As some of you might have seen on our website or wherever, we're doing a few webinars in this series, and then we're going to basically suspend our webinars until October or so, after a couple in April. And so we finally decided to do a subject that is our namesake and is very, very close to our hearts. So tonight we're going to talk about our birds on the river. If there's new folks with us tonight, just so you know, you should have a couple Zoom controls that look like this, probably at the bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using. There's the chat and the Q&A. And so you can put comments or questions, or if you have tech difficulties there in the chat, you can choose to that we just see it, Paige and Ethan and I, or you can chat with us and your fellow attendees. We cannot see or hear you, and neither can your fellow attendees, just so you know. And then Q&A throughout the presentation. Please feel free to put any questions that you have into that Q&A box, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the sessions. So this is us. You can see up here, this is a picture of our 10th anniversary newsletter. The Missouri River Bird Observatory turned 10 in 2020. Our mission is the conservation of birds and their habitats via science, education, and advocacy. And we did, in fact, get our start on the Missouri River, literally on its banks, before we even had a name or a real organization. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that work, but mostly in terms of how it pertains to the birds of the Missouri River. So, as I said, this is the first in our series. Since the Missouri River is such an incredibly important resource here in our state, and there's so much to it, there's so many different topics, whether it's different taxa, birds, herps, fish, anything, the different habitats that are associated with the Missouri River and the conservation of the river. We didn't think it would be good to just do one session, so we have a series of 4, and hopefully everyone will be able to join us. So this one that we're starting with tonight, Birds of the Missouri River, we're of course going to talk about individual bird species, but just so everyone knows, it's not really an ID presentation. So we're going to touch more on the ecology and conservation of some of the birds that use the Missouri River and its floodplain, specifically here in our state. So one of the reasons that the Missouri River is so important is that it is part of a couple, actually, of our major migratory flyways. So really the Missouri River kind of starts in what we know as the Mississippi Flyway. And these are basically just enormous highways, if you will, in the sky of migrating birds. So they often follow major landforms or major river systems. And you can see from these maps that because it's a biological phenomenon that has to do with migration, they're not exact. You know, the flyways don't adhere exactly to state boundaries or anything like that. They more adhere to ecological pathways and to the actual migration of our birds, of course. So the Missouri River starts in the Mississippi Flyway, and kind of as it angles off to the northwest, ends up in the Central Flyway. And so it's an important pathway for a lot of different migratory species. So this is sort of another view of our major rivers here in the Midwest, and going off to sort of the Northwest and into the East as well. This is from the Missouri DNR. And I thought it was just very illustrative. If you look at all the different river basins, the Missouri ends up really being the largest in its extent geographically, and really in the number of different watersheds that feed into this river system. So when it comes to migratory pathways, this might be even a better illustration if you think of birds coming up, particularly our species that will cross the Gulf into Texas and Louisiana, and then they come up and go north. And if they're going more towards our upper Midwest states, prairie potholes, such as in the Dakotas, etc., or even up to Montana, Canada, and Alaska, the Missouri River Basin is a very important pathway for them, providing a lot of resources along the way, of course. So this is, a lot of folks on here might be familiar with birdcast. If you're not, it is really, really cool. Basically, are flocks of migratory birds in, especially during peak migration seasons, are so dense that they're picked up by our weather radars. Um, and so birdcast takes that information, the Cornell lab takes that information from our weather radar, and is able to both predict and also record migratory bird movement. And so a lot of bird watchers use the prediction, of course, to say, hey, you know, the weather radar is looking really good as far as it picking up large flocks of migrants. I'm going to go out birding today. It's also a great record to have for the densities of migrations right after they occur. So this is a video, and I'm going to play this video, and you're going to see um, this these different colors representing density of migrants, and birdcast has added some arrows to sort of show the direction of movement. And you can see this red line is going to go across, and that represents sunset. So you're going to see our night migrating birds. They're going to pick up and move. And then a yellow line is going to come through at sunrise when migration sort of calms down for the day. So there's going to be a lot of different factors involved, of course, on any particular day. Weather, weather fronts, of course. And also, you know, obviously not all species follow exactly the same patterns, but I thought that that was a really good example of a particular day just last May when large flocks of birds were using that Missouri River flyway and corridor. So as you all can see on the bottom there, this is actually a wonderful graphic of the Mississippi River. And so this was done by a gentleman named Harold Fisk in 1944. And what he did was he researched soil and geologic formations and older records, and made this illustration of how much the Mississippi River had changed over hundreds of years. It changed in course, it changed in how wide of an area it would cover. And before we did a lot of channelization and damming and leveeing of our rivers, our major rivers, this would have been typical. And so I wanted to show this, even though it's the Mississippi River, because by all historical accounts, the Missouri River would have done the same thing. There's a quote that's something like, the Missouri River eats levees for lunch, because before we really got it under control, which ecologically speaking hasn't turned out that well, it would have done all of this meandering. It changed course. It created oxbows, which are these that you see, and chutes. And you can imagine, looking back, what it would have been like if our river that kind of just goes through one channel right now were allowed to move all over throughout the whole landscape. So this is a modern day picture, but this is up by the Nebraska-South Dakota border, where in this particular location on the Missouri National Recreational River, a lot of the river's ecological integrity has been conserved. And so this is probably what it would have looked like in many parts of Missouri before we wrought so many changes on the river. So let's orient a little bit here. This is mid-Missouri. So this is our area. Folks are familiar with Carrollton is here, Grand Pass Conservation Area. We're gonna zoom in there in a little bit. So you can see that, you know, if you imagine what this might have looked like 200 years ago, 300 years ago, certainly you wouldn't have had roads. You wouldn't have had all of these bisected agricultural fields. You would have had more bottomland forest habitat, going up through the bottoms to wetlands and ever up into things like wet prairie areas. And you can see by looking at this aerial image that there's really not a lot of conserved natural habitat along the Missouri River here in mid-Missouri. So this right here is Van Meter State Park, just for a little more geographical reference. Over here is Baltimore Bend, part of the Big Muddy National Wildlife Refuge. And so when we started working here in Missouri, we worked on the Missouri River at Grand Pass Conservation Area. And so this is a close-up of Grand Pass. The area is about like that. And then this again is Van Meter State Park. And so you can see there are just these really, really, really narrow swaths of riparian forest habitat along the river. So when you think of a migrating bird or a migrating flock of birds, and you consider them going up through the Missouri River Valley, they're really going to be bottlenecked by this available habitat. A lot of our species, some of our species, you know, don't mind agricultural fields, but a lot of them do need either wetland habitat or riparian forest habitat or somewhere in between, or possibly, you know, wet prairie or even upland prairie. So where we worked here is it's about 150 meter or so wide little riparian buffer. And it definitely did sort of concentrate migrating birds. So what ended up happening, which was a great surprise to us at the time, was that throughout a few years of running a migratory bird banding station there in that little riparian section, we actually added a lot of birds to the existing Grand Pass species list. And at the time, if folks were familiar with the Cash Sparks program through the Audubon Society of Missouri, now the Missouri Birding Society, they and also MDC staff would compile a list, simply a checklist for Grand Pass Conservation Area. This is you know, right before eBird really got big, and now the Cash Sparks program has been like integrated into eBird. So I think we ended up identifying through banding 23 species that were added to the list at Grand Pass. And this was really surprising because there are excellent and amazing birders that bird this area, but Grand Pass is known for shorebirds and waterfowl, and to some extent rails and bitterns, and to some extent raptors. Probably because those riparian buffer zones are quite small, and there is more extensive forest habitat within easy driving distance over at Van Meter. Grand Pass wasn't really known for these birds. So, you know, birds like ovenbird and black-throated green warbler were a couple species that we added to the list, and they're, you know, not super uncommon birds. So here's a quick, it's just kind of a fun video of some of the birds that we caught, which were, you know, a good representation of the birds that use this riparian area in this flyway. And I note that the numbers that you'll see on the bottom are not the final numbers of this particular banding project that ended in 2013. But it's a good representation of sort of the proportions of birds that we caught of each species. So I hope that was kind of fun and came through for everybody okay and wasn't too choppy in video. So a few of the birds, it was really, really hard to pick a few to talk about tonight. But I just wanted to mention some of my favorites, certainly. So wood thrush, which I was really surprised that we, found in that particular area in pretty good numbers. And we had a lot of return birds, like birds that we banded in any given year, and they would come back because they were breeders there. So I always sort of associated them with larger tracts of high quality older forest, especially for breeding. But we did have them there consistently until our site, which we really intelligently put on the river side of the levee, was completely flooded out in 2011. And then the next year, we had far fewer wood thrush, which was kind of interesting. And we sort of hypothesized that it was because of the I mean, the understory got really, really decimated at the site that we were working at. Wilson's warbler is, of course, a passage migrant through Missouri. They go and breed in the very far north. And I wanted to show you in the next slide or the slide after that, just a really quick animated occurrence map that I find really interesting for that species. Indigo bunting was the most, if not the most common, then certainly one of the most common birds in this area. They were also birds that came back year after year. And then prothonotary warbler, of course, which in Missouri, the Missouri River, according to eBird data, is getting up towards the northern part of their range in our state, at least. They go a little farther north in Illinois, but I think Ethan's going to talk a little bit about them and their breeding in these bottomland forests next to our rivers. So I just wanted to show a couple of these really cool occurrence maps. So as some folks might be familiar with them, but as I play this, we're going to go through January, February, March, April, May, etc. And this is based on eBird data. And so you'll kind of see one thing that always struck me is that the way that indigo bunting particularly sort of comes up from the Yucatan Peninsula and then starts spreading out over our river systems in the east. There with May, June. And then, as I mentioned, the Wilson's warbler. So if you look at this, I actually was kind of surprised based on my experience of observing these guys in the spring. But if you look at this occurrence map, they really migrate more in the west. But then when they come back down on their southward migration in the fall, you'll kind of see what happens there. So here's April, May, June, July, August, very far northern breeder. And then they really come down more so through the center of the country during fall even than they do during the spring. So this particular picture is from the documentary The Messenger. And so Ethan and Paige are going to talk a little bit more about the conservation of the Missouri River and its importance to birds. And I would just leave it by saying that birds have a message for us. And so I think we need to heed that message, and we need to help them, and we need to, of course, conserve their habitat. And there's a lot of opportunity for doing that in our Missouri River Valley here in our state. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Dan, for that intro. Yeah, I'll go to switch to my share screen. And then share. I'm going to share a portion of the screen. Okay. Optimize for video, share sound. There we go. Okay. Let's see. Wish there was quick keys for this. Okay. Thanks, Dana. And the you saw that the Missouri River covers this huge area. And you saw a few of the birds that she mentioned there, and some of them are more closely tied to it than others. But that prothonotary warbler, that little lemon there, is explicitly connected to it. And so what kind of messages might they have for us? Well, birds in general are just great barometers of our habitat health. And these prothonotaries are as yellow as any canary, and they're as good as an indicator to the health of the bottomland forest and riparian habitats as canaries are for coal mines. It's they'll often adjust. I mean, they're so connected. We had all that flooding a couple of years ago, and they'll adjust their nesting based on flood levels and come up but they'll be somewhere near the river. But a couple of years ago, they came all the way up to people's backyards and downtown Arrow Rock up on the bluffs, basically. For this bird here, I think I'm gonna jump into a little conservation perspective just for a slide or so, and then move along. But I think it'd be good to kind of look at it through this lens. Our awesome state ornithologist, Sarah Kendrick, called in a pile of experts to look at bird populations in Missouri in a global and a national context, in a regional context for this bird plan. So that's with mainly the Department of Conservation. And we can look at all these species like this, but I'll point out this bird, and hopefully you can think about these other bird species that we talk about through this lens. And so you'll notice here, this is from the bird plan for prothonotary warblers. Actually, I should pronounce it correctly. It's actually prothonotary warbler, although nobody pronounces it that way. But here you can see that they're a watch list species. They're regional priority species. BCR means bird conservation. There's a couple right here. And their global population has declined, like a lot of birds have, 38% since the 70s. And then we have a conservation score, and I'm not going to get too into that, but we look at a variety of factors: global population, threats on wintering grounds, threats on breeding grounds, all sorts of stuff. And then then they say, okay, this is where they're found. They're found in bottomland forests. And what do we need to do? We need to restore and maintain it. That's kind of the bottom line. Most of that habitat happens to be in the alluvial valley. But that said, they prefer bottomland forests. And we've mentioned bottomland forests a couple of times here. So what are these things called bottomland forests? How are they really different than other forests? And what kind of birds might they support? Well, for one thing, they're just beautiful places like this. It's a beautiful place to find a prothonotary warbler in. And it's a natural community type. And it's declined a lot over the last couple hundred years. It's dominated by like oak hickory, mainly in the Missouri River Valley. And it was a major component of the Boot Heel region and the Grand River region in Missouri. But they've declined like 90% due to the typical things like agricultural conversion and stuff like that. It just provides really great quality habitat for a suite of birds. And I've seen this little spot here, this beauty spot. This is next to the Blackwater River in Saline County. And it's like this little remnant island of bottomland. And I've seen so many bird species just in this little patch. Like this red-headed woodpecker lives there. They prefer that oak hickory kind of forest. They love the flooded timber. And there's usually quite a few at Van Meter State Park that Dana mentioned. Even though, as you can see from that map, it was, good 2 miles from Grand Pass, 2.5 miles from the river, but they're still within eyesight. And so as far as that natural community is concerned, there are a few subtypes, and they range, but it's sort of like wetlands. They kind of look at them like we do wetlands, how much moisture those soils hold for a long time. But some subtypes are really different, like these dry mesic bottomland forests and some of these other ones here. They like the in the Ozarks near their rivers, they have these really steep gorges carved out by the rivers, and that's where you'll see these stratified canopies of trees of different levels along these steep inclines, and you'll see these beautiful blue gems like this a cerulean warbler just kind of flitting about in those because they like that kind of canopy structure and they like that type of habitat. Um, so they can be different from the Blackwater, the Grand River, the Lamine River, and the Missouri River, or just like the ones that I showed you before from that one along the Blackwater. So they can be really narrow or they can be really wide in places. No matter what, pileated woodpeckers just thrive in them, and they become really, really densely populated in bottomlands. As long as there's enough room, enough bottomland, the trees are big enough, and they reach the right stages to host these birds nesting and foraging. And they like to have these old trees where they can reach in and get those big fat grubs out, those megalodon larvae to help feed their young. But in any event, just it's a pretty charismatic big species to see in the bottomlands, and where it's a good thing to have them there too, especially for the other critters like this. These appropriately named wood ducks, which many of you may be familiar with, often use pileated cavity nests. They're often seen up high in the limbs of the bottomland forest trees, and hens are called squealers. So you often hear them squealing away. So it's a good name. They make quite a fuss when they're startled or agitated, and while looking for good places like pileated woodpecker cavities to dump their eggs in. The females are quite beautiful too, but for some reason they just don't get quite the attraction that the male does. They're pretty exquisite. They really are. He's handsome, but he's really not the best caregiver in the world. Females do the brooding for about 14 days, and then the young, they get brooded in there, and then they get a lot of the early nutrition actually from the residual egg yolk, and then finally, the young can jump out, and they fall quite a long way sometimes when they leave that nest tree. And I don't think they even really call that fledging yet. They don't call it fledging because mom usually hangs on for another month or so, and helps kind of show them around a little bit, and helps do little distraction displays when predators come around. But usually it's about a month. It depends on where we are and latitudinally, but and what time of season, how early in the season they were born, but or hatched. But so they're just a pretty neat critter that loves the bottomland forest. I can't imagine what they would do if they fell out of a tree and didn't have a really good. They just had a bunch of land to cross to try to get to a river or a larger body of water. So where was I in river habitat? Anyways, well, where is that river habitat? Is it right there on the bank of the river? Is it way up in the kind of the tributaries? What really defines that kind of river habitat? Well, I think directly over the river is pretty obvious one to think. So we can start there. At least we know that's going to be river habitat. You're right over it. And colonies of aerial insectivores like this beautiful ruffling swallow, they spend most of their day on the wing, and they're foraging right over the river, catching these emerging invertebrates that are coming up out of the water. And then they're also nesting right in the cutaway banks as well. So that's an easy one. But then you can think, if you look on the rocks and on the side of the banks, you'll see some of these other bird species like this beautiful spotted sandpiper. And they all kind of bob and weave, picking up bugs right from the surface and sometimes in the water a bit near rocks. And they just sort of bobbing, kind of, you see them like almost moving with the rhythms of the river as they go along. But they're always like on floating logs or right next to the river, or sometimes you'll see them out in a wetland or something on a mud flat looking for inverts. But they're not really cruising up into the foresty areas that much. And so you got this little guy right here. And very much that same type of edge bird. You'll see them bobbing and weaving, hanging on the forest edge. This is a northern water thrush, and it migrates through Missouri, and it's got its cousin, the Louisiana water thrush, as well. And they have a beautiful song. And we caught many of those at Grand Pass. I don't know how many of those we banded, but it was quite a few. You saw Dana play the video of the number of banded birds there. They they, uh, they nest near the rivers as well, in a smaller tributary. So they might help you gauge as being like kind of indicators of where the river habitat is. This bird is kind of an indicator of that, going up into some of those streams. There's another bird here, and I'd be really remiss not mentioning this one and the piping plover. This is the interior least tern, and the piping plover as well. They're both federally listed birds. The one is kind of predominant. Well, they're not really very common. That's why they're listed, but predominantly occurring, I guess, in either corner of the state, the northwest with the piping plover, and the southeast with mainly near Cape Girardeau down that area. Interior least turning out a little bit up by St. Louis and up north, I think. But I'm not going to talk about them because we actually have Trisha Crable from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who's a threatened and endangered species expert. She'll bring those up on March 23rd, and I think Dana mentioned those earlier. In any event, these last few birds feed close to the ground and in the water. But there's, like the rough-winged swallow, there's another bird that takes to the air that really loves these river habitats, and it's this one. And you might be really lucky to see it. It's been expanding their range, following the rivers up through Missouri. And this is the Mississippi kite. And wow, what a beauty. It's just so strikingly beautiful. And it's dazzling when you like look at its acrobatic flight as it's pursuing, anything from dragonflies and invertebrates to bats to, you name it. It's got a pretty wide diet, but it's just remarkable to watch and fly around. And it just graces us with his presence every year. As Paige will attest to, it's pretty commonly seen in Arrow Rock now. And it's coming up from they're not exactly sure exactly where, but they think it's South Central South America. So we need to do some work on that bird. I'm willing to go track that bird down. But it comes up in a downtown Arrow Rock again, up on the bluffs, and so it's using that whole range. Although throughout its range, they do prefer old growth, so they want to have some bigger trees around. That's for sure. So I guess that's one way of looking at kind of the river habitat influence. But this guy is probably hanging out in Arrow Rock because of the Big Muddy and the Jameson Island unit. And Dana mentioned those briefly before, and you might be saying, what is the Big Muddy? Well, it's an old term for the Missouri River, for one thing, but I'd be really, really remiss not to mention the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the refuge system a little bit more closely. We are really fortunate to have this. It was on March 14th in 1903 when Teddy Roosevelt established Pelican Island down in Florida as the first unit of the wildlife refuge system. And some people thought the idea was kind of for the birds. And well, as the saying goes, it ended up being that way. If you look at it, this is absolutely brilliant because Dana mentioned, technology wasn't as good back then either, but Dana mentioned those maps of the flyways, and our understanding has grown so much of them. But you can follow up all the way up from the Louisiana. You can follow all the way up the Missouri River, out the Mississippi, up the Missouri, and you can see all these refuges that were placed very wisely to provide refuge for these migrating birds. It's just brilliant. So close to our hearts is the Big Muddy units that Dana has mentioned. And right here, you can see where these are located throughout. These are great access points for citizens to be able to experience this. And you notice the headquarters is pretty close. Look, Arrow Rock is right there. And so if you look at the little town of Arrow Rock, here's this huge unit. It's directly adjacent to our headquarters, so we're really lucky. And this is one of the three wildest, this is one of the wildest, if not the wildest, in a remote area on the river in Missouri. So it's pretty cool. And oh my, we've got this Lewis and Clark Discovery Trail here in red, and that thing is packed with protonotary warblers and wood thrushes. And in the spring migration time, the trees are dripping with all sorts of birds, black and white warblers, rose-breasted grosbeaks, tanagers, you name it. It's amazing. I had a really good recording of a wood thrush on that trail, but I like seeing the visuals, and our field project leader, Eric Ost, actually captured a really good video of a wood thrush. And I can tell it's handheld, but it gives you the idea, not only the sights, but the sounds and the experience of the bottomland forest. It just makes it such a valuable habitat. Here it is, the wood thrush. Isn't that just like the most lovely flute-like sound? I call them pan sometimes after the flutist, you know, they're just remarkable. But you can enjoy this too. So birding, you know, birders are beginning to catch on this great resource, and it's evident from these eBird lists. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology has that community science portal. If you're not familiar with eBird, community members have seen 134 species on the Jameson Island unit and 170 at Arrow Rock State Historic Site. But I'm willing to wager that some of those Arrow Rock sightings were from the refuge unit area. But to sum up my part here, to not drag it on too much longer for you, I just want to say that, you know, we appreciate these things. We can advocate for them. We all, including the birds, live downstream. So from the headwaters, you know, all the way that we mentioned, all the way up in the Northwest, down into the Louisiana coast, where we have good friends down there that really depend on us to do good river management so that they can have good habitat down there as well. I mean, Louisiana lost 2,000 miles of coastal land in the 1930s, and since the 1930s. So recent production projects have that I've seen personally have benefited 36,000 acres and more than 60 miles of barrier islands that are helping protect these birds' habitats and peoples and roads and buildings and public property and all that. So we've seen it, you know. Here's a newspaper clipping from their Missouri River flooding a couple years ago. Our system was not designed to handle all the water that we're getting now, especially with climate change. You know, that's not helping at all. So dams are having trouble keeping up. You know, rivers, levees are buckling. They can't do it. And here's kind of an image of what happened with those floods a couple of years ago on the Missouri River. Now they would go out into this floodplain, you know, every 100 years or so. They typically would not flood to this extent this frequently. So it's we have a lot of interconnectedness with these watersheds, from those upland edges where the water thrushes go all the way down to the river to the turns. And you know, they depend on things like those sandbar habitats and sand flats. And it's just amazing how the whole thing is used and how it can be kind of ruined if it's not managed properly. So speaking of which, you know, after that flooding, the governor of Missouri set up a task force to deal with it. We call it FROG, but it's the Flood Recovery and Advisory Working Group. But he didn't employ any conservation professionals among the five non-agency groups out there. And so we pleaded to get at the table. There's a lot of different groups like us. We even wrote letters and things, and I've provided links that will be available in the follow-up email and also be on our YouTube channel. But it's still an ongoing thing, and people can can get involved and help out and advocate for good, sensible, sustainable management of our river and our rivers in general. So if you want to do more help for these natural communities, and I'll just mention a few organization, and we'll provide links to these groups that you can reach out to, because they're finding good long-term solutions for this that benefit everybody. I would mention Missouri. Well, there's Great Rivers Habitat Alliance, Missouri Coalition for Environment, Sierra Club, Stream Teams United, Missouri River Relief. And with that, I'll hand it off to Paige.
Thank you, Ethan. That was great. Are you going to put those links in? Do you have a list of those ready to go? You're on mute still, but
I put them on the in our Word document with all the resources.
oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
So everyone, I'm going to just kind of wrap up by taking a step back and looking at the Missouri River as a whole. Just very, very briefly share some facts. So here's a map of the river, which in length is 2,341 miles approximately. It is the longest river in the United States. And the headwaters of the Missouri River are in the Rocky Mountains near Three Forks, Montana, at an elevation of 4,045 feet, beginning at the confluence of the Jefferson and Madison rivers, and joined about half a mile downstream by the Gallatin River. And it flows from Montana southeast through the Missouri River Basin, through North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, into Missouri, where it meets up with the Mississippi River north of St. Louis. So it is quite the river that we have running through our state. And I'd also like to acknowledge the past names of this river. So before it became known as the Missouri, the river was known to the Native American clans in the area as Pekatanui, which in the Algonquin language meant big muddy. So that's partially where that nickname comes from. So the river and the state were named after a Siouan tribe living along the river, and through some miscommunication with early European explorers and their guides, became known as the Missouri. This tribe called themselves the Niatuchi, which loosely translated means people of the river's mouth. But history knows them as the Missouria, from the Algonquin name for the tribe, which means people of the big canoes. So that is how our organization's namesake got its current namesake, the Missouri River. But there's a long history to even the naming, or not so much a long history, but there is a history to the name that for which it comes. And today, approximately 10 million people live in the Missouri River Basin. And this includes people from 10 states, people from a small region in Canada, and from 28 different Native American tribes. There are approximately 150 fish species in the Missouri River, and about 300 species of birds live in the Missouri River's region. And that includes all those different areas that Ethan talked about. And it might even be more than that. That's an approximation. The mighty Missouri, the big muddy, it goes by many names, and it can hold such meaning to many different groups of people. I hope you enjoyed our first webinar in our series that aims to connect you and everybody to the Missouri River. So this was our first one talking about birds. We always love to start with birds because that's what we're all about. But we really want to connect people to this amazing ecosystem and this really awesome resource that we have. So in continuation with our Missouri River series, we are hoping you attend our second webinar next week, which is 20 years of connecting people to the Missouri River with our amazing partner, Missouri River Relief. And we've put together quite the event for all of you. So during the webinar, Missouri River Relief's Education Director, Kristen Schulte, will give a brief presentation on all the work Missouri River Relief has done, which is amazing work with volunteers, and some of you may be volunteering with them as well, and what they've done throughout the years and how important it is. And it kind of has this two parts. So We're also going to include their virtual field trip of the Missouri River, which they recently filmed. So you'll want to watch that ahead of time, and it features fantastic scenes of the river, discusses the changes to the river over time, and all the people involved in its conservation. So the video is sure to make you feel more connected to this magnificent ecosystem. So you'll watch that ahead of time. We ask that you do that. And then there'll be a presentation, which will be followed by a panel discussion featuring past and present staff of Missouri River Relief. So I hope you're super excited to attend this event because it'll be awesome. And I'll put the links to that in the chat. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening. And don't forget to go out and enjoy the river if and when you can. And now Ethan and I are going to do our best to answer all of your questions. All right.
Yeah, sorry you don't have Dana anymore. She's doing another webinar right now.
She's a hard worker. All right, so I'm going to put the links to our upcoming webinar in the chat.
I think somebody made like a snarky comment. There are 45 bands on one bird. No, we banded 45 birds of that species. That's what that meant. Maybe it's just because it's kind of bander speak, you know. That we also use wonky alpha codes to describe birds. We don't say Louisiana water thrush. We say Loa. We did 45 bands on that Loa. So, are those indigo buntings flying over the ocean or going up the peninsula? What a great question that is, because all these different species have different strategies. So I have a friend that I worked with in Tennessee who had previously run a banding station on the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. Her name was Ana Paula Hernandez Rodriguez, and she caught over 2,000 indigo buntings every spring as they made their spring launch out over across the Gulf, directly over the Gulf. So those birds that are crossing the Gulf are going 500 miles across that thing. And if they hit any headwind at all, they could likely go into the drink. So different species will sometimes be circumgulf, and they'll come around the Gulf edges around Mexico. And oftentimes species will do that in the fall, but they'll be in such a rush to get that prime breeding habitat in the spring, they take the risk of making that giant leap straight across it.
Yeah, that's always so amazing.
The Blackwater River. Sounds like a good song, doesn't it? Or a good band. The Blackwater River is right in our backyard here in Saline County, and there's actually a Blackwater River watershed, and it dumps into the Lamine River, and then the Lamine River, and this is all in the same county pretty much, going into Lamine River, and then the Lamine River flows into the Missouri River. So we're kind of like 2 steps up from there. And from us, it seems like it flows away from the river at first, and then it comes around and it swings around and feeds into it. So I think there may be a couple conservation areas somewhat related to it. I'm not sure, but maybe Marshall Junction might be. And you have to look around in that region to see what public areas are accessible. The photos that I showed from that little remnant bottomland forest were from private land, part of a suite of over 100 sites that we've surveyed for wetland sites across the state. So there's so many great bottomland forest lands to see. And if you feel ambitious, I would encourage going down into the southeast part of the state, seeing Mingo National Wildlife Refuge or Big Oak Tree State Park. There's a bunch of them. Just Google bottomland forest public lands in Missouri, and you'll find some good ones as well.
Sorry,
I think Mary Jennings asked.
Yeah, we'll need some clarification. So Jack asks, how many miles of the Missouri River run through the state, and are there any miles of original habitat left? I I will say that I am not sure the answer to that question, but I know that I'm fairly confident that our panelists at our next webinar will be able to answer that question.
I can
Ethan,
tell
do
you
you happen to know?
we lost 70 miles of it when we straightened it. And so, and also another thing to consider about the shape of the Missouri River is that as it comes in from the west, it gets right about to the middle part of the state here in Saline County. And right around Van Meter or so, it starts to change. And definitely as it gets into Columbia Rocheport, it starts hitting rock and walls. It used to be, it's more spread out naturally and historically meandering out west. And then it really sort of tightens up as it gets up through that kind of geology. So as far as natural habitat, you could almost look at a Google Earth image and say, aha, but the key areas would be definitely close to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuges or the big muddy units would be the key areas to find. There's also, what's it called? Columbia Bottoms down near St. Louis. That's just a great public use area, although it got really hit hard by the flooding. And not all the facilities are open again. But there are those expanses there. I would say the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers probably has maps of the Missouri River, and actually they refer to each section in river miles, so that might be a good point and a resource too.
Yeah, that would be a good resource. Yeah. And then D has a question. Think I-70 bridge expansion is going to affect some of Overton Bottoms. What do you know about plans to mitigate the damage? Again, I do not know enough about that plan to know about what the plans are to mitigate the damage, but I'm sure there are people working on it. And some of our later webinar guests may know the answer to that, even though I don't know.
Yeah,
So I apologize.
I know that there's some issues going on with the riverfront development, I think near Chesterfield and St. Louis. That's kind of a thing that public wasn't really aware of until the last minute. So it's been kind of hard to have any public input on it. And it's almost too late at this point. So it's a good question to ask, and please pursue it. I will look into it a little bit more myself. I really love that area. And I know that the Katy Trail goes right through there as well. And that's such a great trail. And then just northeast, as you're crossing the bridge, there's some beautiful caves up in there and stuff too that are worth worrying about. I know they have some bat species that we're worried about in there too. I'll look into it.
Awesome. And then I want to share Teresa's comment because I think it'll be great information for everybody. So MDC encourages recreational use of the river, fishing, canoeing, kayaking, and so on. People sometimes think it's too big to use recreationally. So MDC programs are held occasionally to help ease people into the idea of getting out on the river. So I think that's some great advice. Yeah, and I'm sure they'll also have resources about, because there are like certain times that you don't want to go out there, like when it's flooded, or different things like that. So some safety tips as well. But
Yeah,
Merbo did a canoeing trip, and it was really fun.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. I grew up on a smaller river, and I saw these big rivers in Missouri. I was like, oh my goodness. And then I got contracted to do a cerulean warbler search for the federal government up on the Mississippi. And Dana and I went up there and we put our canoe in with the dog in it. I was really scared, but it was just as peace and mild as you can expect. The only thing you had to look out for is carp jumping at you. And that was about it.
Yeah, I think it'll be really fun to kind of share stories next week with Missouri River Relief, because they've got some good ones.
Do they?
I highly recommend that webinar, everybody.
They've lived it.
Yeah, they've lived it. I'm not sure to this question either, Ethan, if you have any comments. So Elizabeth asks, when I was walking on the Little Blue Trace Trail by the Little Blue River, there were about 9 big nests in a sycamore tree by the river. It looked like cranes were in all the nests. Never seen anything like it. Is this related to our program today also? So I think what she's asking is like, are cranes a bird of the Missouri River? or its tributaries?
Artidae is this whole family that's pretty closely related. But things like sandhill cranes have this global, like world famous migration where they all settle up on the Platte, just kind of west of the Missouri River up there in Nebraska, which is just if might have to travel all over the world to see a migration that's that spectacular, but we've got one right over there in Nebraska. So look up the International Crane Trust first. Second of all, that totally fits in with this webinar. And I really wanted to mention some of that a little bit more, but I couldn't get into it. And I want to get into wetlands more because wetlands are so tightly, connected to our rivers, and they're so important for it. But I was lucky enough to stumble on a couple what they call the rookeries, and these are colonial nests of things like great egrets and great blue herons, and they often prefer these taller stands of trees near their waterways, and that's likely what you saw. And if they're white, they're likely egrets, and they're so beautiful. And we've seen a couple of species we got great blue herons, we've got great egrets we've seen in Missouri. We've seen snowy egrets in Missouri. They're the ones with the yellow feet, and they're a little bit smaller. And then we got little blue herons, which are absolutely gorgeous, and they're not quite as common, but I've seen them in wetlands north of Saline County. So you probably saw egrets or great blue herons, but knowing you probably saw white birds and said, that looks like something cool.
For sure. And I'm just gonna add into the chat or maybe just, I'll put it in the chat too, but someone in the chat was asking us about some of the indigenous terms that I used and kind of the origins of the Missouri River's name and the resources. So first, I would recommend the book People of the River's Mouth by Mike Dickey, because it's just got like so much information in it about those Missouri tribes and clans. And then I'm going to post an article from Missouri Life as well that I think talks about it and quotes Mike Dickey in it. So I'll post those resources in the chat.
He's a state historian. He's been located around Arrow Rock for a long time. He's our resident expert. He spent a lot of time personally knowing a lot of Native Americans and learning and studying their culture and their history and trying to shed more and more light on it. And so thanks, Paige. Those are super resources.
Sorry, I accidentally raised my hand. I pressed the wrong button. It's right
I
next
saw
to
that.
Q&A.
Yes, Paige, do you have a question?
Yeah. All right. And yeah, okay. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything in the chat.
Yeah, guys, check the chat.
But I think we are ready to wrap up. Thanks everyone for the kind comments. Oh, and then could the nests in the trees that were talked about, could they be a rookery of egrets and herons?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, right. That's kind of what we're talking about.
You know what they say about that is that the birds that exactly they, who's they? When somebody says that, who's they? They say that birds that are colony oriented birds like that have an interesting level of intelligence that allows them to communicate resources to the other members of the colony, saying, this is the patch in the river that we ought to be fishing at, and they sort of let the other ones know. It's one of the benefits of being a colony nester. It's sort of a community.
Yeah.
I love rookeries. It's so cool. They have such cool sounds. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I love when you get to like learn the behavior and language of birds, and it clues you into like what's going on in the environment that maybe you can't see. And I think that's a great example of that, is like, oh, there are a lot of fish eating species here. Probably quite a bit of fish in that pond.
There's a good water source nearby, or all of a sudden they're making a lot of different sounds I haven't heard in a while, and it'd be like, oh, here comes an eagle. They're kind of worried about that eagle or something.
Yeah.
That's another bird I really wanted to mention, was the bald eagle, because they're so tightly connected to our refuge system, as well as wetlands and rivers.
That is a great transition to my next point before we close, because eagles are mentioned in the virtual tour of the Missouri River by Missouri River Relief for the next webinar. And I have some people asking about recording. So this webinar is being recorded, and we'll send a follow-up email with the recording and all most of the resources that we shared. And if you can't, and I remember now, this is a question that was in the chat, which is if you want to attend the next one, but you can't make it for whatever reason, I would recommend still kind of like registering or signing up, and then you'll get put on our list to get sent the recording. Otherwise, through email. Otherwise, you can find all of our recordings on our YouTube channel. They're all posted there publicly as well. Yes, Ethan.
A special shout out to Laura Moreland, who pointed out to her it looked like my images looked fuzzy and pixelated, and I think that might have something to do with the video. But in any event, I will edit this video and look at it and make sure that those images are sharp for the final posting to YouTube. But thank you for mentioning that.
Good point. Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all of you for listening to us today. I hope you learned something, and that you're excited to attend the rest of the series, because I think it'll be really awesome.